Okay, thanks, guys. Yeah, so today's talk is all about components. Yeah, and when you don't have a title for a talk, yeah, follow the instructions left by location. Okay. Oh, that's embarrassing. That's all about me. All of these things, essentially, you could probably find on the internet about me. The important thing about this slide is please follow me on Twitter if you don't already. I work currently at the National Audit Office. I've been there a while, and I've been doing this Salesforce thing for quite some time as well. So, yeah, we are talking about components tonight, and I didn't want to talk too much about the philosophical nature of what a component is or might be, but essentially, we can do that in the pub later if you want. The important thing about components is really about an approach to development, so which essentially involves reusing stuff. And when essentially you're looking to reuse things, essentially, it gives us a fair amount of benefits. We can limit the amount of boilerplate code that we might repeat. When we want to make changes, we can make them in one place. And when we're thinking about whether your code, whether it's Apex, methods, classes, or in JavaScript and elsewhere, essentially it forces us to think about how we write our code. If we're writing our codes for reuse, essentially we might want to add additional parameters to our methods so it can be used in different places. And that's essentially the lesson that we can learn from components. So, lesson over. It's story time. I'm going to talk about a couple of these features, these user stories that have had quite a big impact at the National Audit Office where I work. I should say, actually, the National Audit Office is a public sector organisation, and it's the good part of the public sector in that we're independent from government, and we audit and investigate the other government departments. You might often see us in the public sector Public Accounts Committee meetings, if you follow the Parliament television channel, various other things in the news about our investigations. So, first of all, is these components. So, we have a message board and a portfolio page, and these are assembled using sort of base components. So, essentially, they're very, very easy to put together with a few sort of stitching here and there. The message board is based on a tab set component with lots of tabs, and essentially breaks down, gives you a list of messages depending on that particular topic, that particular tab. And the portfolio page is based on the lightning tree grid, which is essentially, well, we'll see what it looks like when we get to it, but essentially the important stuff you need to know about your projects, essentially, it will tell you various things about your financials and those things. So we're going to talk firstly about the message board. And before we get into a demo of that, we just want to give you some background. Quite a while ago now, we transitioned from Classic to the Lightning experience, and there were some things essentially after we did some UX. Essentially, we sat down and we realised that there was a few things that we needed that we hadn't quite tied down as to what we were going to do, namely what we're going to do on the homepage. We had an existing dashboard which essentially was, I think it sat in an iframe and it took about 10 seconds to load, which was never really good because people thought that Salesforce was taking a very long time to load and then just then ignoring the dashboard when it loaded. So I sat down with my stakeholder at the time, quite informally, and we just boiled down the requirement to essentially what we needed to do. I mean, essentially, we just needed to give people prompting for things that they needed to do within Salesforce to essentially sort out things that they might have forgotten to do, like their time cards and various other things. So we boiled it down to essentially throw what data issues essentially are important that we want to flag up to people, and what actions we want to prompt them with. And if we could find a way essentially to get them to navigate to that area within the system, that will be a bonus. So this is quite a long time ago, because essentially the first iteration was an Aura component, and this went live in around 2019, just after Salesforce had released Lightning Web Components. So we got some good feedback, but there are a number of things, essentially, requests that we had. Can we see the number of messages before we, so we don't have to click on each tab to see what's in there? And then we always thought we were going to add other areas that people might be interested in, HR areas and learning and so on. Obviously, with everything in the world, Lightning Web Components coming out, existing priorities crowding out essentially a backlog. There was quite a time before actually we got round to creating the LWC version. But we did create it, and the basic structure essentially looks like this. We have a top-level component which basically contains the tab set component, and that's essentially where our tab labels are and everything else. Within each of the tabs is a list of messages, and then obviously we have a component which makes up each of the items in that list. The message component itself is made up of predominantly, I think, two base components. One is basically a lightning icon, and the other is essentially a formatted URL. So we can give people essentially the information they need to do, a link to where they need to go within the system or externally from Salesforce. And the lightning icon essentially comes with a property where you can change the variant of it. You can make it amber, you can make it red, depending on whether it's a warning or an error. This is essentially what we did. Okay. Now, basically, I need to switch to demo. Woo. So if we can find the right screen. Woohoo, there we go. Okay, so this is our message board. This is how it looks. As you can see, we have tabs and sub-tabs. Obviously, the data that you see is obviously quite fictitious. But essentially, yeah, we've got our various compliance things that we want to talk about, our projects, things to do with our learning. And the recent innovation that we managed to do is I managed to default the top-level tabs, essentially the parent tabs, to the tab that had the most messages in it. So this has actually been really useful in the last couple of months, because essentially previously we were defaulting to the time cards because that was considered to be the most universally compliant issue that people had. But now essentially most people are used to doing their time cards, they get reminders. And so by switching it essentially to, in this case obviously it's a project tab, and for most people it will probably be the project tab that has the most messages in it. It allows people essentially to re-engage with the message board. If essentially you're loading the message board and all the time you're seeing messages about your time cards, you might be tempted to ignore the rest. And believe me, people will ignore what they want to ignore. And you get selective blindness. People will look at things. So we can show you how it works. We click on one of the links. It takes us into our project page. And then essentially we can come and deal with that particular issue. So that issue was one of our milestones. You can see that I like tabs. I've got loads of tabs in my on my project page here. So essentially all I need to do here is I need to put in a date. Let's put in today's date. We allow it to submit. This is an old Aura component that needs swapping out, actually. There we go. So then we can go back and we can hit our refresh button, and lo and behold, we have, we've checked off that particular message, and and the number of projects, the number of messages in that project tab has also changed. So that's essentially how that works. By the way, you can stop me at any point and ask me questions. That's fine. What I'm going to do now is switch back to the slides before I show you some of the stuff in VS Code. Largely because I think at this stage there are some things that are a little better and easily described in the slide deck. So how does it work? Well, obviously we've got to get the data from somewhere, and we're using Apex to retrieve our data. Now, normally when you see Apex Aura-enabled methods, essentially you'll see that the pattern at the top there is essentially that you are returning the results of a query back to the component. So because we're looking at a lot of different records across the system, and what I'm doing here is slightly different. So I'm still querying the data, and then essentially I'm entering into a loop, essentially to ensure, and I'm creating essentially a message object for each of the items in my data, and then I return a list of those message objects back to the component. Essentially, that means that the component has the properties it needs, and I don't have to write any of that code in JavaScript, which means the client, the browser, is not having to process that either. So, yeah, again, that's useful. And again, we reuse this message object for each of the messages that we have. Okay, these are three of the things I'm gonna delve into in the code in a second. I'm gonna show you about the @wire function, wiring a function, and using the refresh Apex method, and then talk a bit about the dependent properties. So basically, how we add up the number of messages for the parent tabs, and more importantly, how I'm dynamically setting that default tab to be the one that has the most messages. Okay, right. Let's see if we can. Okay, right. Okay, so, oh yes. Bit of housekeeping around Lightning Web Components. They do come normally with 3 files. So you'll have an HTML file, which is essentially where your markup is. You'll have your JavaScript file, which is where essentially you're doing most of the controlling, handling, button clicks, and various things that the user might be doing. And then you'll have a metadata file as well, where you can target areas of the system, areas of Salesforce where you want to place your component. The HTML for this is not particularly interesting. Essentially, we have it's basically set inside a Lightning card with various titles and things, and you can see here that we have our tab set, and we have nested tabs and nested tab sets within that. Yes? You can't see the VS Code. Ah, right. That's probably because I need to do that. And then that. Okay, right. Can everyone see that now? And is that clear enough? Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, right. So as I was saying, not terribly, don't really want to go too much into the HTML itself, because essentially it's just the repetition of the base components again and again. What I want to show you is really how the @wire works with when you're wiring a function. Now, you can wire to a property, but in my case, essentially, I'm wiring it to a function, and that allows me to set multiple properties from the data as it comes in. So this is our particular method that we're querying here, the get time card messages. It requires a parameter for the user ID, and then so what we're doing here is we pass the value that the Apex is sending us. We pass that to the function called wired time. Now, the first thing that we do here is in our function is we set we give the value to a property called time result, and time result essentially is used all the way down here when the user clicks on the refresh button. So this is our handle refresh. So what we do here is we're identifying which which event has been fired, which type of event. And if it's the time cards, then essentially we run refresh Apex, and we pass in this property, and then Salesforce then essentially will handle the refresh of that element for us. Okay. The next thing that we do is essentially what we're doing here with this constant is we deconstruct the value into its constituent bits, into error and data. So if data is true, we're going to run one set of code, and if error is true, we run another set. That means essentially that we can set our properties to have essentially the right values that we want. Obviously, we want data to be true. We don't want to have any errors. So in this case, we set the time messages, which is essentially the property that our component has in the HTML. Time errors will be undefined. And this badly named property essentially is the one that is used to set the tab label. It's a string value, and essentially it has the word time cards, and then in brackets we're putting data.length, which is essentially the number of messages, the number of items within my data. You'll also see I'm setting this property here, and that's used later on to set the to assess essentially which of our parent tabs has the most messages. Any questions so far about wiring that up? Because I'm going to move into talking about the dependent properties. So what we do, or what I'm doing here is I will evaluate whether data.length has any value at all. If it has a positive value, essentially what I'm doing is I will make a change to that property, the active tab. So the active tab is the property that is going to lives in the tab set component and sets whichever tab is going to be the one that's going to be open when the component loads. So if I go all the way up here, we can see essentially we have a getter and setter for this particular property. And what we have here is basically this particular if statement at the top there. If the active tab, if the incoming value has changed, essentially then we're going to run our set of code. And then what we need to do, because some of these properties, which are essentially the length of the data, the length of the messages, the number of messages within each tab, some of these might be undefined. Their query may not have run yet. Because we're using @wire, it will load as and when Salesforce has the resources or is asynchronously, essentially. So what I'm doing here is essentially making sure that each of these properties actually has a numerical value, in this case 0. Once I'm happy that all of the parent tab properties have a particular have a 0 value or have the value of the number of messages, we can then run this next set of if statements. Now, there wasn't a particular elegant way of doing this when I was looking into it, but essentially we're taking, in this case, the project messages and then saying, well, is it greater or equal to any of the other tabs? And then if it is, then we set the active tab to the value 8, which is the value of the projects tab. Then essentially we do pretty much the same. So if that doesn't run true, we do the same for the learning messages and so on down the chain. If we get to the end of all of that and the active tab is still undefined, we set it to 2, which is the time cards. And finally, essentially, the active tab is returned for that value. Hopefully, I've explained that fairly well. But if you've got any questions about the message board, please ask now. I'm going to because the next thing we're going to do is going to talk about the portfolio page. Rob.
Not so much a question as more as a feature suggestion. but is there potentially mileage to actually, instead of having the active tab as the one with the most messages, actually messages have a weighting. So for example, a project message is more important than a timesheet message. So actually a amber project message outranks a red timesheet message, and then you can kind of have this kind of prioritization system.
Are you trying to get in trouble with HR?
Yeah.
Yeah, because if potentially, you know, with your plan around max count, effectively is what it's doing. You could have a lot of time. You could have somebody that's got a lot of timesheet messages because they haven't been doing their timesheets properly, to the detriment of actually more business value project type messages. So,
Yeah.
These timesheets don't have business value.
Yeah.
You know where I've worked.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, ultimately, it's down to what the business thinks it needs in terms of that. I mean, if you want to weight them, you can. When initially we went live, there was a big outcry essentially when we had all the time or for the time card messages. Essentially, when their icons were red, people were quite upset about that. So we had to ensure that they were amber. Largely because essentially with things like flexible working and various other things, it's like, well, yeah, I haven't done it yet, but I know I do need to do it. And then obviously, people get very. And the other thing, of course, is that deciding what icon to use for which particular thing can also be, don't use a thermometer icon because it looks like something else. Yeah. Yeah, and for learning, for example, if you use an icon which looks like the mortarboard hat, it doesn't actually look like a mortarboard hat when it's rendered on the screen. So there's a number of considerations that you need to make. But yeah.
Would you have done anything differently in retrospect, and what would it be?
What I know I would have done is the message component itself is made up obviously of an icon and a formatted URL. If I'd been thinking ahead, I might have put a switch in there, so basically it can either use a formatted URL or a formatted text, because quite often I need to use a message, but there's no actual link to send it to. So I could use the message component in other areas outside of the message board. And that would have saved me time. I mean, ultimately, it's probably something I'll do further down the line when I've got time to do. Anyone other than Rob got a question? No, go on.
Just one last one. So, I appreciate you've got another component to show us. But
yeah.
Do you find yourself when you're building the Lightning components creating like architectural objects, so objects that aren't objects necessarily in their own right from a Salesforce perspective, but from a JavaScript and a Lightning Web Component thing, it's convenient to remold a lot of the properties into an object just to make it easier to work with?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Essentially, you're grabbing a few base components and putting them into your own custom component, and then essentially it makes it easier essentially for you to work with those going forward, because in the case of this component, essentially there's lots of internal workings that essentially mean that you set we know which type of message it is because we know we're calling a particular class, and when we send it down the chain to the message list knows, oh, I know I'm time cards because I'm in this tab and I've set the type to be time cards. And it knows, right, I know the placeholder for this is, for the URL is, the tooltip for that particular URL is a particular value. I know that the icon is a particular value, and so on. So, yeah.
You have like wrapper objects just because it's easier to work with them in LWC. And if you weren't using LWCs, you wouldn't necessarily need them.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
But it depends on like where you want your processing time to be spent.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's go. Okay. Let's go back to the slides. Okay. Okay. So we're done with the message board for the time being. A portfolio page. Now this is kind of brand new within the org at the moment. It's only a few months old, and this is based around. This supports essentially a brand new process. So a few years ago we had a new chief auditor join us. Our chief auditor is essentially appointed by Parliament every 10 years, and over the last couple of years, essentially, when we're sort of reviewing projects and everything else, essentially he decided that it would be a good idea to have a monthly review of all of the projects. So he wanted project directors essentially to be reviewing their financial information, ensuring it was up to date, ensuring that his exec team were aware of essentially any issues and problems within particular audits, particular projects. And so this process was developed. I'm using Lightning Tree Grid to show this data, essentially because it exists essentially within several sets of summaries or hierarchical data set. I'm also using modals, which I think were brand new this year, essentially to pop out various summaries. And they work slightly differently because essentially, as you'll see, they don't feature in the HTML. They're entirely inserted from by the JavaScript. So let's dive into demo. Right. Let's go. Okay. So this is the Lightning Tree Grid. As you can see, it resembles a table, but it works like an accordion component. So essentially, we can expand and collapse rows. We've got some basic text for the casual user, essentially, so it tells them essentially what to expect, how to work the component, and in bold, essentially, how to sign it off. Each row in the table represents a project, and you can see the names. Just essentially, so you can see essentially, yeah, these are fictitious names, fictitious ministries and departments. Sorry, did I give the game away? Ministry of Magic. Sorry, it's not real. So each of the rows within the table are essentially represent a project, but they also represent a type or a time period. A little word about each of the columns. Essentially, we have this thing called a baseline budget, which is a new concept. Essentially, we are benchmarking the budgets at a particular point within the process, i.e. when our chief auditor has agreed that that's what they are. And then obviously, then we have the current budget, which is what the budget is now, our costs, what the costs are to date, the forecast, what that is what we believe that's going to be at the end of the project, variance, which is this thing here, and that's the difference between obviously the budget and the forecast. And then we have some other fields about the fee that we hope to recover from the client, which will be Parliament in most cases, when we last signed it off, and the role that the logged-in user has on the project. So this is a process and a page dedicated to support the project director, but in terms of delegation, anyone who has a role on the project will be able to interact and look at the detail. Essentially means that two people can have the same conversation looking at the same data, and obviously anyone can step in and act on behalf of the director if they're not available. So when we expand our total, we can see the breakdown by particular budget types, and then if we expand it further, after a small delay, essentially we see the breakdown by financial year, and then finally, essentially, we can see it by month. So what most of these projects are telling us is essentially that they overcrank their budget in the first year, and obviously now they've reduced it to the size essentially of what the actual cost was. We also have a number of other things. So if I go over here, you can see we've got our first modal component in our row action, and essentially we can see the changes since we last signed off this project. So you can see actually, yeah, we've changed the budget around. We may have changed the allocations within our, so our forecast has dropped, and so on. And again, essentially, the modal component essentially sits up there quite nicely, and then essentially this one isn't self-closing, but we have the little panel that says actually we can, it tells the user how to close it. We also have the sign-off buttons. So essentially, when we check the boxes on the side, we've got two flavors of sign-off. We've got sign-off all, which essentially will help us to sign off every project that we've selected. This means essentially we can fill in the form, and in this case we just want to put comments in, and that will be allocated across all of those projects. If we don't want to do that, if we want to maybe to have be a little bit more selective about the projects that we want to sign off, perhaps we don't want the same comment against each of them, we can sign them off singularly. In which case, essentially, we have this pop out. And again, what we're showing here is obviously the changes since the last sign-off, a little bit more detail about the project. And we can give a comment here, which is individual to that specific project. New a couple of weeks ago is this idea of qualified sign-off, which is basically to say, yeah, I'm signing off, I'm doing my job in signing off for the month, but I recognise that there are some elements here that aren't quite up to scratch, which essentially means that if you're a director and you've just been dropped to the worst project in the world, it's fallen in your lap because someone's left or something's happened, it means essentially you have your little get out clause to say, well, why didn't you sign it off? Well, no, you can sign it off. You just have to qualify the sign off. So those are the elements. Those are the elements that the users will see and interact with. Before we go and look at some of the code, anyone got any questions?
I would just like to add something. Like when users go through same thing multiple times, right? I think we have just 4 lines of text that can be an icon tooltip or a hover over, because after some time they are not going to read what's happening with the 4 lines.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, people will have selective blindness essentially, and this is essentially what you need to be aware of essentially with any kind of user interface, because essentially after a while it becomes like you will only focus on the things that you really want to focus in. I don't know. In a couple of months, maybe we might have to change the text. We might have to make it different color or something, or change the background just to make it a little different, so people are paying attention. But yeah. Okay. Right. Let's go. Okay. No.
I just want to say it's also a really good idea. Like if you're working with Sales Cloud and you have opportunities and you have nested opportunities under a group account, for example, that's a really, when you present it, all I've seen like, oh, this is like my group opportunity, and then I have all the other opportunities underneath fitting into
yeah. Yeah. So yeah, the tree grid is very useful to showing any kind of hierarchical information. So this could be parent accounts and contacts, all sorts of things. In my case, it's financial information. This is the top end of our Apex class, which is powering our component. As you can see, once again, essentially, I have my classes essentially that I'm pre-processing, if you like, essentially the data. So when I'm querying across about three objects when I'm getting the data back. So what we're doing again is we're putting this into a structure so that the component can consume it. You can see the first class here. Essentially, basically, you can see these roughly resemble the columns that you've seen in the component. And again, at the bottom here, we have a list, and the list is essentially of types. Types is essentially the next row in the table. Our types again have similar have similar properties, similar variables, and again they contain another list of data structures, and again that's quite useful essentially because I'm able to reuse this and populate a different component using the same class. So essentially, there's a version of the lightning tree grid or various tables which use the same data which sits on the project page. Okay, this is our HTML. Again, this is quite lean in terms of the code that's sitting here, and obviously these are inside sort of LWC ifs. So essentially, this is basically our property, which we toggle on and off when we're clicking the boxes along the side. If they've been checked, and essentially we'll show the button groups there. And further down the page, essentially we have our lightning tree grid itself. And again, this is inside our LWC if we're passing data to that property grid data, then we'll find that it's going to display that component. If that's not got any data, or indeed if we have grid data error has a value, then essentially we'll show a different component. Right. Let's scroll all the way to the top. Right. There's quite a lot going on here, so I'll try and be as brief as I can. We have two Apex classes that we import here. We're also importing various other modules, such as to get the user ID and various other things. We have to import our modal components, as well as the other modals, essentially for navigation and refreshing Apex. We set up our row actions and our columns. The columns are essentially quite interesting. You can set cell attributes, so you can put icons in there, specify where they are. We have to tell the table essentially what type it is. And if you played around with the Lightning data table, essentially the principles is pretty much the same. The type essentially that you want when you're referencing dates is date dash local, which gives you essentially the local time. So essentially you get the date written properly, not the American version. Right, down here is where we're calling our Apex. Again, I'm wiring it in. I'm wiring a function, passing in the user ID to get the data back. But essentially, what I need to do is at this point is one of the things about the Lightning tree grid is it needs to be the nested items need to be keyed with underscore children. So when the data is reaching our component, it looks something like this when it's represented in JSON. So essentially, our array of types is called types because that's what we called it in the Apex class. Now, we can't start an Apex variable with anything other than a letter, unfortunately. So what we have to do is we have to change it from this structure into this structure. So essentially, it has to be called underscore children. So what I'm doing in my first little bit of code there in that function is I'm swapping out essentially the array to one that is called underscore children, and I also add an empty array, again called underscore children, which so when the component loads, it knows that there's another level, essentially, so it allows the user to click on it. Now, there's probably a better way of doing it than running it through a for loop, or a couple of for loops in my case, but this was working for me, and largely by the time I got it working, I wasn't really going to mess around with some of the more native, shall we say, JavaScript methods. You can see here the commented out section, which will get you part of the way there. It will swap out the types with an array called underscore children. It won't do the final bit, essentially, where we are looping through that final section to add our empty array. If anyone has any ideas about doing that in one line of code, that would be really useful, but I haven't worked that one out yet. So that's how essentially how we're getting the first two layers of data in. The next element essentially we need to look at is basically when our user toggles essentially open the next panel. So we run this get details event and handle this get details function when the event is clicked. Now you can see we're evaluating this property called has children content. So has children content is not a property in our data, but when we get it back from the component, the component essentially has added a couple of properties: is expanded, is true, has children content is true. So we're able to essentially evaluate that when it comes back to us from that event. If it's false, i.e. there's no information in that level of the data tree, then essentially we're going to call our details Apex class, and that's essentially going to get the data we need. It needs a couple of parameters for the project ID and the type, and then it basically goes off and it queries that data. Obviously, we're not querying all the rows that we need straight away because someone might have over 100 projects within their thing, and it might stretch over maybe 3 years. And then if you're bringing back a record for every month in that particular financial year, that's an awful lot of data essentially that you're working with. So to do this way, essentially, it makes the lazy loading work quite nicely. So we pick up essentially the parameters that we need from the event. You can see that essentially the project ID is buried in a substring in the row ID. The row name is the type. We also need the row ID because we need to, once we've got that data back, we need to insert it in the right place in the data grid. So when we get the data back, we're going to do the same thing. This time our array is called monthlies, and we swap it out for one called _children. And then essentially we run, and then to put it in the right place in the data tree, we run this function called add children to row. Now, this function is entirely copied from the boilerplate information, and I've even left the comments in so I remember how it works. But basically, essentially what's happening here is we are stepping through essentially the data tree, trying to find essentially the right row. So basically, if the row essentially that was toggled matches the one in the parameters that we sent the function, essentially then we will add those elements back into that data tree at that point. If it doesn't find it, it essentially keeps running the function until it does, and then it inserts essentially it back into the data tree. Let's go all the way back up. Okay, so I think I've probably run over a bit of time, but the important thing here is to show you exactly how. Hold on, if I can find it. How we load up the modals, because if you remember when we looked at the HTML, the modals essentially don't live in the HTML. We have to fire it off from the JavaScript. So essentially what we do here is we have this async await pattern, and we name the modal we want to open, and we use .open. It's really that simple. We can, and then there are various properties that we can add to the modal. We can make it large. We can put a label in it, and then any other public property that we've added into the modal, we can also give those particular values as well. So in this case, essentially, we fire in the project ID and the project name, and obviously then the component will load its various other bits. The modal itself doesn't look particularly interesting. You'll notice that actually it's not a base component of its own. It's made up of 3 base components: a modal header, a modal body, and a modal footer. Obviously, you can put in, put what you like inside of those, and then the JavaScript essentially to close the modal is again very simple. This.close, and again you can pass a result back to the component that opened it. However, you've got to be really careful and read the documentation there, because that will only work if you have Lightning Web Security switched on. So the handling the events between the modal that pops up and the component that launched it is possible, but only if you have Lightning Web Security switched on. So for me, that doesn't quite work yet, because we haven't quite reached that part of the journey. Okay. Any questions on any of that at all? Yeah.
So what did you say in the last bit? The modal is one component, and what kicked it off is another component?
Yes.
One is the child of the other, they're siblings, are they?
Yes, so essentially, what's the best way to explain? Let's go to, you can see that. So this is the main, if we think of this as the main component, and essentially we've loaded our modal. So the modal itself doesn't live inside. Doesn't live inside the HTML. All we do is we import the modal into the main component, and then we use the JavaScript methods essentially to open the modal, and then within the modal it has a method essentially in this case when the button is clicked, or alternatively you can just call that method if you want to call it automatically, and it will close. Sorry, did that answer the?
Well, I was just thinking, so if you wanted to close the modal from outside, possibly not, because I've had that problem before of trying to get components to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And how joyful it is to start siloed off. I come from a front-end web development beginning, where you can get to talk to each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for example, if we sign this one off, essentially, once it's finished doing its spinning, essentially it will self-close, because there are no. What it does in this case is it checks if there are any more projects in its list to sign off, and if there are no more, then essentially it should self-close eventually.
Where's the confetti?
Oh, auditors and confetti, don't get me started. Hi.
So I was just having a quick chat with Rob, and we noticed in your timestamp that you were probably originally deploying just before Christmas. So it's one of that amazing things where you deploy without checking leaving for holidays, right? What is the coolest thing you have broken with it?
The coolest thing
that was the 23rd of December, and then your other bit of code was the 29th, so between Christmas and New Year.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. I mean, I have no, I don't know how to answer that. What have I broken? Probably almost every. Oh, yeah.
Always a sandbox before it's fully tested.
Yeah. And Any more questions? Because I'm sure we've run way over time.
Just one thing, I think on the question he asked, different components and pages interacting with each other. I think Salesforce also does the Lightning message channels. So if you are dealing with something, message channels are multi-page structures are very good to communicate with.
Yeah.
I mean, in that example, the modal took responsibility for closing itself. It was this.close.
Yes.
It reaches a certain endpoint and it closes itself.
Yeah.
I think what they're actually doing is having an extremely loosely coupled architecture, where it just says, go and launch this and take responsibility for managing yourself. And what it seems to be doing behind the scenes is injecting itself into the DOM of the page there to do the rendering. and then cleaning up after itself. And I think Salesforce are doing that for us.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to get much more fine-grained control without kind of rolling your own solution.
And what do you mean by security? Switching it on or off. What do you mean by
So there are two flavors essentially ensuring that your code is secure as Lightning Locker and Lightning Web Security. Lightning Web Security is the new preferred method for securing your code and ensuring that it's encapsulated and doesn't bleed out into various other places. We haven't reached that critical mass yet. We still have Aura components in our org. So obviously, when we get to a place where we replaced a lot of those, then we'll probably move to Lightning Web Security after a number of tests, after testing all our components all over again. So that's what we mean by the security in that sense. Yeah.
I was just wondering if Todd's talk about data loop might help you rename those JSON objects.
Oh yes. Yes.
It might kill your performance, but yeah, it works.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. No more questions? Cool. Then we're done.
Thank you.
Cool.